what's the difference between the land that a trail traverses and the trail itself? Or who has the authority to grant what happens inside of a national park, or in a national forest, or a trail that's inside of the national forest on a national park? These have been some of the questions that have plagued different court systems along the East Coast for the last 5 years. It's imperative to understand that the Appalachian Trail was first proposed in 1921 and was finished half a decade later, and is now part of the National Trail System. It's a footpath-only trail that spans 2,193,000 miles between the states of Georgia and Maine, officially crossing 14. Due to its grandiose nature, it's managed by multiple entities. These entities are both private as well as public and include, but are not limited to, the National Park Service, the United States Forest Service, the Appalachian Trail Conservatory, state agencies, and thousands of volunteers across the many states that love the trail. But this began the questioning of who the ultimate power of the trail is. This began in 2015 when the Atlantic Coast Pipeline first proposed a 604-mile natural gas pipe to run between the states of West Virginia all the way over to North Carolina. This too would run through the George Washington National Forest in both West Virginia as well as Virginia. The National Forest Service permitted the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to cross the 528-foot section of the Appalachian Trail inside the George Washington National Forest. Quickly after these permits were issued, an appeal was filed with the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is an appeals court based in Virginia. This appeal was filed by the Cowpasture River Preservation Association, the Highlanders for Reasonable Development, Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation, the Shenandoah Valley Network, Sierra Club, Virginia Wilderness Committee, and the Wild Virginia. They stated that the United States Forest Service did not in fact have the authority to grant such permissions, and that they were in strict violation of the Mineral Leasing Act. This act of 1920 helped to decide who would oversee public lands and their developments. In this act, it noted that the Secretary of the Interior delegated the duty to the National Park Service. This would mean that the United States Forest Service, who originally granted the authorization to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, did not in fact have the power to permit such a pipeline to be traveling under the Appalachian Trail. This idea was then pushed into the Supreme Court once it was appealed, and finally, on June 15th of this year, 2020, the court finally ruled on a decision in a 7-2 consensus. The focus on this case was purely on the distinction, if any, that needed to arise between the trail and the land. Anthony Yang, who was the assistant to the Solicitor General, tried to hold that they are in fact different because the trail is just so much more than the land it lay on. The trail also includes things like waterways and bridges that are both man-made as well as natural, that aren't on the ground itself. Paul Clement Esquire, on behalf of the petitioners, elaborated this when he noted that it would not make sense for the status of the land to change every time the route changed. The Appalachian Trail actually reroutes pretty regularly. Things like fallen trees or brisk water crossings can change the path that needs to be taken for the most safe travel because it is on foot. So every time the path would change, or the trail would change, that would mean that the land would change if they were the same entity, which just wouldn't make sense. Justice Alito also brought this type of distinction when he bursted into the conversation, and he stated that he thinks of the trail, he thinks something that is on top of the earth. But when we think of the pipeline, we're talking about something that is 600 feet under the earth. So they're strictly not the same. Ultimately, this decision would decide in that the two are in fact separate entities. The highest court decided that The Trails Act did not transfer jurisdiction of the lands crossed by the Appalachian Trail from the Forest Service to the Department of the Interior. It created a trail easement and gave the Department of the Interior the administrative responsibilities concomitant with administering the Appalachian Trail as a trail. Accordingly, because the Department of the Interior had no jurisdiction over any lands, its delegation to the National Park Service did not convert the trail into lands in the National Park system. In other words, this means that the United States Forest Service does in fact have the authority to grant the right-of-way through these lands because it is in the George Washington National Park forest. The permits for the pipeline were in fact correct, and the building of the natural gas line can commence pending other litigation.